Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome from the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, Jeff Holland.
Thank you. Wow. Well, welcome to our special session on the Solutions Initiative. When we planned this, we thought that if we got 40 people or so, this would be a success. So, well, I guess mission accomplished. Don't leave. We haven't even started yet. Let me give you a little background about this. So the Solutions Initiative was an effort to find some answers to the questions people have been asking. So we've talked a lot about the problem. Now it's time to talk about what some of the solutions are. And the good news is that we have many solutions available to us. So we convened a group of 7 think tanks from various ideologies to discuss how they would stabilize the debt in the future. To make sure we were evaluating them all on a standardized basis, we also contracted with Barry Anderson, former acting director of CBO, and Eric Toder from the Tax Policy Center, to make sure that everyone was being evaluated on an equal basis. So Barry and Eric are actually going to come out first, and they're going to talk about what they witnessed what they saw in terms of areas of agreement and disagreement. And they'll give you a little context, some history, because this is the 4th time we've done this initiative, and they've been participating in all of them. After that, I'll come back on stage with our representatives from the 7 institutions, and we'll talk a little bit about some specifics among those areas of agreement and disagreement. And then after that, you see some tables around. We're going to have a breakout session. So this is our first attempt at an interactive session where the audience will have a chance to go and talk to the individuals who are representing the organizations to find out about the plans that they put together. We'll then reconvene after that and have sort of a share-back session so that everyone can sort of discuss what they found interesting about this project, either about the individual initiatives, the individual plans, or about the initiative as a whole. So with that, let me turn it over to Barry and Eric, who will start this discussion off. Thank you.
Well, I'm Eric. I'm going to speak first. I will talk a little bit about the revenue proposals and how we did the scoring, which is a little different this year than in previous times. And Barry will talk about spending and the bottom line, which is debt. So first on the revenue proposals, they were very diverse, given ideologically diverse organizations. CBO is projecting a baseline that revenues would rise to 19.9% of GDP by 2049. That's a bit higher than it is now, a few points. And the reason for it's going up is a lot of it's bracket creep due to people moving into higher tax brackets with income growth. But another piece of it is the expiration of the tax cuts, the individual tax cuts that were enacted last year. All of the groups would raise at least that much money, but they cluster in terms of how much they would raise in different places. 4 of them, AEI, BPC, the Manhattan Institute, and American Action Forum, would raise between about 20 and 21% of GDP, so very close to or only slightly above the current projection. Progressive Policy Institute and Center for American Progress are kind of in the middle, within the mid-20s, and EPI is at the high end with 33% of GDP. So it's quite a difference in the extent to which groups would use revenue to solve our fiscal problems. However, it's worth pointing out that none of them would reduce revenues, so all of them would raise at least as much as currently is projected. The most interesting to me was the variety of structural changes. I will try to just give a few highlights, because if you think that the 2017 Act was the last thing in tax reform, you're wrong, at least as far as all of the thinking of all of these groups. They would all make fairly major changes. The top individual rates that are proposed range from 35 to 50%. That's slightly below the current 37 and is substantially above. And the corporates from 20 to 35. The current rate is 21. So again, here the tendency is to raise the rates, although some would lower, but only slightly. 6 groups proposed a carbon tax. I found that extremely interesting, given how controversial that is politically, but 6 of the 7 groups included that in their plans. All would change estate taxes, although in diverse ways. Some would reduce them or eliminate them. Some would increase them pretty dramatically. And a number of them would also end the step up in basis of capital gains at death, where those gains pass tax-free, but in different ways. A lot of cuts in tax preferences. The one thing I really want to highlight is, again, ideologically diverse groups are proposing eliminating or phasing out the mortgage interest deduction, which used to be kind of the third rail of tax policy. So I found that very interesting. There are a lot of other differences I won't go on to, but I just wanted to make the point, as you look at these plans, they are very, very big changes in the tax code, and it shows an awful lot of creative thinking and new ideas that are out there. Finally, I want to make a little bit of a note on the scoring. This is the first year when we've done these exercises where we've used so-called dynamic scoring. We always accounted for behavior in scoring, but usually assumed GDP, size of the economy was fixed. In this case, we allowed it to change, and TPC has developed a model which we use it. I just want to say a little bit about what's driving the numbers. In the short run, more spending, more taxes increases demand for goods and services, pushes up the economy, so that has a positive effect on GDP to raise the deficit, but that effect is very temporary. Over a longer period of time, there are two effects going on. One, higher marginal tax rates on earnings or capital investments would tend to reduce labor supply, reduce capital formation, and therefore reduce growth. So that has a negative long-run effect on growth, raising taxes or certain kinds of taxes. And smaller deficits have a positive effect on growth because the deficit reduction reduces interest rates, reduces a crowd-in of capital, and leads to more capital investment. For some of the groups, these two effects worked in opposite directions. For others, they reinforce themselves. So let me just conclude that this was a very interesting exercise and a lot of very, very creative thinking, but a very diverse set of conclusions. I'll turn to Barry.
Thank you. I'd like to jump down to the bottom line here. I'm going to talk about spending a little bit, but I wanted to emphasize, and if you might pay attention to this chart for a second. I believe it was 8 months ago today, that is on October the 11th, we first met to kick off this project. I won't say that Eric and I were busy every single day since then, but gosh, we had an awful lot of interaction with the groups. And I can tell you that, at least speaking personally, I wasn't sure we would come up with a result like you can see in front of us. By that, if you can see that current policy line pushing debt held by the public to the 225% level, give or take, by 2049. I wasn't sure as we went through the process that we were going to see each of the 7 organizations have debt as low as it is. As you can see, it goes from as low as 24% by the AAF to up to 100% or so by CAP. Again, we went back and forth. There were a variety of interactions between both Eric and the groups and myself and the groups about how to score the proposals. And I can tell you how pleased I am when I finally saw this chart after realizing that they had managed to succeed in doing this. I emphasize this because where we're sitting now with such great policy differences, it was very good for me personally to see that 7 organizations with as wide of views as there are can come to this result and really get a better handle on our fiscal policies. That said, let me jump to the spending here a little bit. Just as Eric started out and said about revenues, there were wide differences in the spending proposals. However, I'll summarize them briefly because you're going to hear more from each of the organizations about them. differences really were in four major areas. By far, the biggest one was healthcare. Then there was Social Security. Then there was defense discretionary. And then there was everything else. Healthcare dwarfed everything else, and given its size and what you've heard even this morning about the importance of it, that's not at all surprising. The healthcare differences we had ranged from new programs from CAP, EPI, and PPI to make Medicare coverage more widely available, to AAF, AEI, and PPI proposing to modify Medicare and Medicaid costs through competitive bidding, while AEI also proposed to raise the eligibility age. BPC proposed promoting increased competition, and CAP and EPI proposed negotiating lower drug prices. There's a lot more detail, including one which has Medicare for all and another has Medicare Extra for all. They're going to describe those things in more detail, so I'm not going to go into that here. In Social Security, EPI and CAP would increase benefits, EPI substantially and CAP a little bit more modestly. The other 5 participants proposed some reduction in some benefits. All of the participants, except AEI, would raise additional revenues dedicated to improving the solvency by raising or eliminating the cap or payroll tax earnings. With respect to defense, while some of the organizations proposed increasing defense spending in the near term, and others proposed to decrease it, all 7 proposed defense spending by the end of the 30-year period at relatively similar levels. For non-defense spending, discretionary spending, BPC and MI proposed modestly higher levels. CAP, EPI, PPI proposed significant growth, with PPI proposing the highest level in 2049. AAF and AEI essentially proposed no growth or small cuts. CAP, EPI, and PPI proposed significant investments in other non-interest spending, including universal child care, early education, paid family and medical leave, and unemployment benefits. AAF, AEI, BPC, and MI proposed smaller changes, including reducing agricultural subsidies, and AEI and MI would reform federal pension programs and BPC housing finance. Again, you're going to hear more detail about it, but one thing I hope you can take from this is, given what Eric said, a very wide variety of proposals, both in the revenue area and in the spending area and in different areas of that. But still, this result, if I can pull it back up again, this result, in one sense, I think is a testimony to the real success of the project. 7 different groups, very wide proposals, but all of them proposing things that address our fiscal situation in one way or another. That's it.
Okay.
There's a crap door here.
I will let you walk off. You don't have to. Okay, so now I'd like to call up our 7 representatives. We'll have a short panel discussion here.
How do you want us? Do you want us organized in a certain order?
You can choose.
Should we sit by our partisan?
No, do not. No, mix it up. That's the whole point of this exercise. All right, you get to be next to me, Seth. Okay, so we've already been using the acronyms of our participating institutions. Let's put some faces to those names. So closest to me is Seth Hanlon from the Center for American Progress. Next to him is Ben Ritz from the Progressive Policy Institute. Alan Bayard from American Enterprise Institute. Jason Fichtner from the Bipartisan Policy Center. Brian Riddell representing himself and the Manhattan Institute. Gordon Gray from the American Action Forum. And Thea Lee from the Economic Policy Institute. So first of all, let me just thank you all for participating in this. As Barry said, it's been 8 months or so. It was a lot of work, a lot of thought, a lot of back and forth, and we really appreciate your efforts in this respect. For those of you in the audience, you have a document that sort of describes in a little more detail what's in each individual plan, also shows some graphs and some memos from the organizations expressing in their own words how they describe their plans. we only have half an hour, so we will not be able to touch on everything. But as I said, there'll be a chance for you all to talk to them individually after this session. But so anyways, to get started, let's look at some of the areas that we covered. And let's start with relatively current events. So less than 2 years ago, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was enacted, and that changed tax rates on both individual and corporate income taxes. A number of you, all of you, in fact, pretty much addressed changes to that in one way or another. Some of you raising it, some of you kind of maintaining it. And so let's start there. So maybe, Goran, we'll start with you, because you reverted for individual income taxes to the pre-TCJA rates, and you lowered the statutory corporate rate to a little bit below where they are now, from 21% to 20%. Can you explain some of the thinking behind that?
Sure. So it had been my position during the debate on the TCJA that it should have been revenue neutral. So to the extent that I had to grapple with that in this exercise, I decided to abide by that. There were a number of other base broadening that we sort of built into our plan that I thought was important. And so you'll see on the revenue table, we actually jumped pretty quickly. And I never thought I'd be third in the sort of tax raising race among these three groups, at least at the outset. But in the memos, we're asked to sort of provide three priorities. And my three were tax reform, entitlement reform, and then security. And the tax reform piece is essentially my way of saying I'm going to raise taxes, but be mindful of the design. The entitlement pieces and grapple with some of the other the large programs on the spending side. And then on security, it just is cognizant of, but at least discretionary and also non-discretionary spending will increase. And so most of those priorities are about deficit reduction. And so beginning the revenue increases early matters for that. It matters in terms of interest. And I was cognizant of that. And so that animated a big part of that decision.
Thanks. And so, Ben, I think PPI ended up with the highest marginal tax rate at 45% for those over $1 million.
We were the 50%.
And 50% for those over $10 million. So maybe you can explain your thinking in that respect.
So I don't think that at the outset we thought we were going to end up with the highest marginal tax rates. I think there's a few different reasons why we went up that high. The first was having higher rates at the top allowed us to have lower rates for everybody else. I think another aspect of it was that we have a significant cut on income, well, at least earned income, because our plan is the only one that fully repeals all payroll taxes. And so if you think about an alternative scenario where we scrap the payroll tax cap, add that to the pre-Trump tax cut top rate of 40%, that ends up adding up to something in the range of 55%. So in that respect, comparing those two scenarios, we thought 50% was a relatively reasonable place to end up.
And so, Brian, I think you were, in a sense, you were in the middle. You didn't really adjust the TCJA rates at all. You want to talk about that?
My approach, I've done conservative dream scenario approaches. In fact, when I was at the Heritage Foundation, I did a lot of their report a few years ago. But after working in the Senate for 6 years, I decided to limit myself and try to do something that could be pragmatic and centrist. My approach was, if you put a gun to Congress's head and said you have to get the debt down below 90% of GDP, what would be a plausible and good way to do it? And so I ended up a little more squishy in my plan. In fact, none of my proposals even begin until 2023 because I have a lead-in. In terms of tax policy, part of that is a viewpoint that the lower income portion of the TCJA is not going to be repealed. The doubling of the child credit, et cetera, those are the last things I think Congress would get rid of. And so my approach on taxes was do something a little more broadly. Raise the payroll tax 1 percentage point each from Medicare and Social Security, pare back the health exclusion, tax capital gains at death. Try to find broad-based policies that would affect everybody a little bit, but not hurt anybody brutally. And so that was my approach.
Yeah, thanks. So as Eric mentioned, a number of you came up with innovative ways of raising revenues, not just modifying things that were in the tax law from 2 years ago, but coming up with new sorts of revenue raisers. And so Thea, EPI had proposed a wealth tax. which is not something we have right now. Can you describe in a little more detail what you had in mind?
Sure. I mean, our view is that there are a lot of things that the public sector ought to be doing that it isn't doing. So we had revenue increases very high on our list. And so wealth tax and taxing the wealthy in general. So we did raise the top tax rates on individuals up to 49% in conjunction with a few other things that we did. So brings it maybe the effective rate to about 65%. But a wealth tax seems to me an obvious thing. It's an easy thing. It raises a lot of money. And it is something that addresses only the very wealthiest. Those folks have not necessarily paid their fair share for all the prosperity in the economy, but we also want to make sure that we are funding the things that the United States needs to fund going forward. And so we're going to need to find revenues in a lot of different places. And we raised up the corporate tax rate back to the pre-TCJA level to 35%.
And so a number of organizations sort of looked at other ways of trying to tax wealthy, but not directly looking at the wealth tax. So Alan, AEI, though, went the other direction. They repealed the estate. You repealed the estate and gift tax, although you would tax some unrealized gains at death.
Yeah, so I think that it's important to include both components of that. So really the taxation of gains at death we view as a replacement for the estate and gift tax. It seems like a better way to go. And the estate tax has been plagued, I think, with problems throughout its existence, a lot of base narrowing provisions, a lot of room for avoidance and evasion. It's also, I think, proven to be unpopular, whether that be for good reasons or for bad. We thought the most straightforward approach was to say, let's work within the income tax system. From an economic perspective, capital gains really are income each year as they accrue. And for various reasons, we don't tax them each year as they accrue. We wait normally until they're realized. Now, it would be possible to tax them each year, and Eric Toder and I have worked on a plan where we do that. But in this plan, we thought, let's take, I guess, again, a more pragmatic step that wouldn't be as big a departure from current tax principles, but would still really yield a much better outcome. And that is to say, okay, you can defer these taxes, but not beyond one lifetime. And now we do have a threshold amount there, I think of $1 million or a couple million. And so we wouldn't apply this taxation at death to ordinary middle class people, but we would say that if you're above that threshold, we're going to tax those gains when you die. We're not going to let you defer taxing those gains beyond one lifetime. And once that's been done, we really don't see the need for the estate and gift tax as a separate entity.
And so, Jason, both you and Seth also had some estate tax-related proposals. BPC and CAP. Jason, maybe you want to go first and describe what you've done.
So first of all, thanks to the Peterson Foundation for having us here. And I also want to thank the BPC staff who are all working this together. This is a group effort. So when I say we, I do mean the compromise that went into this. Also, as I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins, so I had to make sure as an academic I didn't wear a tie today. So that's sort of my role. On the estate tax, we were trying to find areas and think about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, where we could find inefficiencies that we could improve. And the estate tax, to Alan's point, has been one that, for good or for bad, labeled the death tax, has various incentive problems, but it's a source of revenue. So one of the things that we did was we just basically lowered the exemption amount, which right now is over $11 million. We lowered it to $2.5 million for individuals, $5 million for married couples filing jointly. And part of that, if you go back to some of the debates in the estate taxes, it was destroying, quote unquote, destroying small businesses and family farms. We thought that level was more appropriate, still to raise some revenue, but do some protection for small businesses.
Seth, do you want to talk about caps?
Yeah, so I mean, to pick up on what Alan was saying, and one thing I was struck with is how many of the plans repealed the step up in basis, what we call loophole in the tax code, right? So, and as Alan mentioned, this is the loophole that allows people, mostly wealthy people, if they hold assets for their entire lifetime, they never pay income taxes on the gain, right? So this can result in billions of dollars going, never being taxed under the income tax. And of course, it creates all kinds of incentives, for people to hold on to assets. And then there's other aspects of the tax code that allow for deferral of capital gains, like like-kind exchanges, which are now limited to real estate, but still allow deferral of capital gains. You can avoid capital gains by giving appreciated stock to charity. So there's all kinds of other reasons. So we think that focusing on the capital gains tax base is crucially important. Because I think one reason is if you simply raise the rate, you're probably not going to get as much revenue as you would as if you really reformed the tax base. So the way we dealt with that was to implement a mark-to-market system, like what Alan was alluding to earlier, where capital gains are taxed, at least for wealthy people, on an annual basis. So there's no opportunity for deferral. And then on the wealth transfer side, because I think we still, because of the level of wealth inequality in this country, wealth transfer taxes is still important and something that we shouldn't throw out the window. But we replaced the estate tax with an inheritance tax so that inherited income is taxed the same as income that's earned.
Thanks. So one of the sessions earlier today, they brought up a carbon tax in the context of climate change. 6 out of 7 organizations here also proposed some sort of carbon tax as part of their plans, except for the Manhattan Institute. So Brian, you want to defend yourself?
I'm not against a carbon tax for energy policy. The reason I didn't put it in is because this is a major deficit reduction exercise, and most of the revenue from a carbon tax under most plans would go towards low-income rebates and investment. And so my approach was simply, if it's not going to be part of a major deficit reduction plan, if it's going to go into rebates and energy investment, then that would be something done outside a major deficit proposal. It wasn't an ideological thing. It was a let's stick to major deficit reduction proposals.
All right. Well, thanks. Okay, let's turn to the outlay side of the budget. And so, as you also heard in an earlier session, there's a lot of concern about future healthcare costs and so on. Almost everyone came up with some sort of healthcare proposals, but they were way all over the board. Some expanding federal involvement in healthcare, others sort of working with what we had, others trying to reduce costs. And so this seems like a really important element of the budget, one we should address. So one solution that was in a few plans was to provide premium support. The AAF had this, AEI and MI all proposed some sort of premium support. I know, Gordon, maybe we'll come back to you. Do you want to sort of explain AAF's premium support proposal?
Sure, though. On this one, I think it's just appropriate to express quite a degree of humility about projecting, particularly with respect to premium support, essentially what a premium would be something like 30-some years from now. And so my health number is, in my view, actually probably artificially low. So I don't actually view a substantially meaningful difference between sort of where I end up and like what an AEI plan would be. There's just so much uncertainty that attaches to this. So in this exercise, I viewed it more as more of a budget exercise rather than here's the design of my health plan and here's exactly what it will end up 30 plus years from now. So,
Alan, maybe you want to explain a little bit more about how you view premium support? Alan.
Yeah. So we view premium support as kind of balancing the objective of lowering federal spending on health care while maintaining essential protections for those who are in need. So we envision that people would have a choice of different plans, including traditional Medicare, but that if you chose a more expensive plan, you would pay a higher premium, and if you chose a less expensive plan, you would pay a lower premium. So we view it's an important way to bring choice and competition and fiscal discipline into the system. There would be subsidies, however, for retirees who have low lifetime earnings and for those who have health conditions. And so again, that's trying to bring in the social protection element. Just one minor point, although actually I think you could view it as a major point, we do view that the best way of targeting health subsidies in retirement years to people in need is that you have to have a program like Medicaid that will protect people who are in poverty, but beyond that point, we think it's a lot fairer and a lot more efficient to target the subsidies based on what the person's lifetime labor earnings were, instead of what annual income they ended up with as a retiree. So today we rely a lot on that annual income measure. That really penalizes people who continue for one reason or another to work into their retirement years. It penalizes people who saved more than somebody else. We think looking at the lifetime earnings measure really gives a good overall picture of what resources that person had access to in their lifetime. And so without penalizing saving, without penalizing people who work longer, we can target the help to the people who are in the greatest need.
Yeah, thanks. And so, Jason, BPC basically wanted to propose making some reforms to the current tradition, like the traditional Medicare program?
Well, this is one of the challenges I think many of us had, and we heard this in earlier panels, is how do you crack healthcare reform? What does that mean? Social Security, you can do the math, we can show solvency for benefits. Healthcare is really challenging. What are the costs going to be? How are prices rising? And a lot of this deals with, we heard in earlier panels, we have a current system that was set up to basically stick with the employer. We also have a system which there's so much asymmetric information problems. What does healthcare cost? You go ask them, they say, oh, I paid a $10 copay. That's not what it cost. That's what you paid. And so we have a lot of problems trying to get competition in the marketplace when we have hidden prices from the end consumer. And so we were grappling with this, and BPC has a healthcare proposal and a plan they're actually working forward to in a larger scale. And so we didn't want to step in front of that proposal. So we sort of made tweaks along the way to try to find areas where we could increase competition through more price transparency in other areas. But healthcare is a huge issue that we have to tackle, and I think we need to look at sort of the fundamental areas in which prices are hidden and try to get those more in the open, like better forms of drug rebates, more competition in areas where we see lacking of competition in insurance markets. That can help bring prices down, but that's not going to solve everything. We have to do a much larger involvement in healthcare.
Yeah, and so a number of you did propose a much larger involvement in healthcare. I think EPI might have had the largest one.
We did, and that was quite intentional. Our current healthcare system, in our view, is inefficient, expensive, and unfair, and that most of the problems with including the rising costs are not going to be addressed by tinkering around the edges. So we went all in for a Medicare for all, a single-payer healthcare system, and that's one of the reasons why our costs were high. But unlike you, we don't really see a budget plan as a deficit reduction plan. We see a budget plan as a way of talking about the country's priorities and values. And if we can't give health care in one of the richest countries in the world to everybody who needs it at a price which it doesn't break the budget, then we aren't doing that. So we went all in for Medicare for all, so everybody would be covered by a single system and essentially expanding the current system. And we had to fund that through an increase in the payroll tax and other ways that it's expensive enough that you can't fund it just with taxing the wealthy or taxing corporations. You need a broad-based tax, but we think it's well worth it because over time you're going to save a ton of money as a country and you're going to produce much better results.
Yeah, and so both PPI and CAP also had significant expansions in healthcare. Maybe you could describe your plans and also address how you would address per capita costs or how you would offset the cost of your expanded plans. Ben, maybe you want to go first.
Yeah, so our approach was, we want to see what's the big difference between us and other countries in the world on healthcare. And there are a lot of studies that show that really the biggest difference is not so much utilization or demographics, but it's that we have higher prices, and that's as a result of years and years and years of an uncompetitive and inefficient system. And so one of the benefits of a single payer or public option approach is you have the federal government with monopsony power. It would be the largest consumer of healthcare, and so that gives it more power to negotiate with health insurers. And at the same time, though, we wanted to preserve the private system that allows competition among insurers to see if they could develop more innovative ways to manage care. And so we thought, well, what's the best way to get the best of both of these worlds? And we settled on what we call default price healthcare. And basically under our regime, we give private insurers the ability to use the same or similar rates to what Medicare negotiates. It's a little bit higher under our plan than Medicare. But basically, we give insurers the ability to get better prices out of providers, and we do it in a way that encourages them to work together, innovate, find more efficient ways of delivering care. And we think it's important to try something like that and see what we can get out of the current system before doing something that might be more disruptive and unpredictable.
And I think our plan probably falls somewhere between the range of the EPI plan and the PPI plan. So it's a universal healthcare plan called Medicare Extra for All, and it essentially allows everybody to choose the option of whether they already have employer-sponsored care or not, or any other care, to choose the option of enrolling in the public program of Medicare Extra. We enhance Medicare benefits, so there's out-of-pocket limit and covers things like dental care that are not covered now. But I think crucially, also giving people the option of retaining their employer-sponsored care and giving employers the option to buy into the system for their employees. So we think of it this as sort of a transition, ultimately on the goal to universal health care, but retaining some of the choices that people have, which I think is, public opinion polls have shown, people support the choice of retaining private insurance, at least a lot of people. So that's a sort of political call of how to get to universal health care. And then I think on the question of how do we reduce costs, I think it's the same as what Ben and Thea have said. We simply use the power of the federal government to negotiate down prices from medical providers. So private rates to providers will reference the Medicare rates, and then Medicare as a monopsony power buyer has the power to reduce those over time.
Can I add one thing on this? Because healthcare is a major issue for a lot of us, and people went different routes. Some went the expansion of government routes. Some try to put more market competition into this. We could talk all day, and we would probably mostly all agree on a lot of inefficiencies in the healthcare system we have today. But keep in mind that someone's inefficiency is somebody else's income, and they fight very hard to keep their income. So every time we try to talk about reducing inefficiencies, there's somebody saying, no, that's my money, that's my premium support, that's my salary, that's my whatever. So we're always fighting those political problems we have in the public choice sphere about preferences that are given to healthcare. One of the issues where a lot of us did something out with healthcare was try to remove the exclusion for employer-provided healthcare from taxation, because that is actually in some ways still a benefit, sort of like income, but it also is a transparency issue because it hides the true cost of healthcare to the consumer, i.e. the worker. And if that was a taxable benefit, they might start negotiating more about their healthcare and the costs, and that's a market way to sort of get some more price competition into the system.
Your comment reminds me of the clip that always makes me laugh, where they show some older person complaining that they keep the government out of my Medicare. So there's always somebody, everyone's got their own perspective on sort of how much government involvement there should be.
If I could say one quick thing on both of those points, just to be clear, EPI actually chose not to deal with the politics of this situation, but just to say, this is what we think would be a good system, and here's how to fund it. But in terms of getting rid of the employer-sponsored healthcare tax break, I think it's hard to do that if you're not providing the healthcare for all, a single payer system, and so on. So we get rid of all tax breaks except for the earned income tax credit, but we do so while providing what we consider to be a really viable alternative for folks, not just leaving people, once we've got this employer healthcare plan, is leaving people bereft.
Yeah, and I should say that a lot of the plans, I think you all intended them to be comprehensive, so we're sort of parsing them out here into various sections. But as you're starting to get into, the idea is that you make one change somewhere and you're going to offset with another change that might not even be directly related, but somehow that presents a comprehensive budget plan. And that's what we were going for. We're looking for comprehensive budget plans that would help stabilize the debt. But back to specific policies then. So almost all, you all address Social Security in one way or another, many by adjusting benefits, retirement age, or cost of living adjustments. So it's sort of the commonly known ways of dealing with Social Security. Can you discuss some of the ways that you presented to make Social Security more solvent over the next 30 years? I'll throw that out to whoever wants to tackle Social Security.
I guess I'll start, because I'll take the middle ground on that one at BPC, because again, we're trying to find compromises that are politically acceptable as a compromise solution to both parties. So we did raise some revenue. We raised the payroll tax cap up to $195,000 and then index it to average wage growth plus, I think, 0.5% from there on forward. We do some tweaking on the payroll tax rate and the 1 percentage point increase. But we also do some reforms. We have a new established minimum benefit that replaces SSI but makes a stronger minimum benefit for those who really need it. But we also do some changes to the bend points and the benefit formula for higher income people. We tax 100% of benefits for higher income workers. We also made sure to make things more on the equity standpoint. We basically make a stronger survivor benefit, but we reduce the spousal benefit, which tends to benefit more higher income to household workers. So we're trying to do reforms that make the program more fair and more sustainable and make sure it's a protection for those who truly need it.
So a couple years ago, I was working at Bipartisan Policy Center, and I helped work on that plan. And when we were at PPI, we wanted to try to do something a little different, whereas that plan, which I still think very highly of, is very good under the current system. We wanted to think more innovatively and think, if we were going to really tackle Social Security from the ground up, what would we want the system to look like? And we like how in the current system, it's an earned benefit. At the same time, I like how other groups like AEI, their flattened structure makes benefits more progressive. And so we wanted to find a way to combine those two elements. And so we came up with what we call a work credit benefit structure, where benefits grow not based on how much you earn, but how many years you work, so that it's both an earned benefit because the longer you work, the higher your benefit. At the same time, a low-income worker and their executive boss, if they put in the same number of work years, they're getting the same benefit out of it. And it enabled us to raise benefits at the bottom, cut them at the top, and end up what we think is a pretty good place. So that was our main mechanism for doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on Social Security, we didn't take a defensive posture about just needing to close the deficit, but we said we actually need to expand this program, because if you look at the U.S. society, there's a lot of people who do not have adequate retirement income, and they do not have a pension at work anymore, and 401ks, I think, are totally inadequate. So we wanted to expand Social Security, particularly in terms of the benefits at the bottom end for those earning less than $16,000. So that was, we did, I think, follow the DeFazio-Sanders Social Security expansion plan in terms of expanding benefits. And then we made some adjustments, lifting the cap and increasing the payroll tax rate, which I think are pretty straightforward and pretty simple to do in order to make sure that Social Security was strong and solvent into the future.
Other thoughts?
Well, I'll add one more because there was a pause here. We also want to make sure we're trying to support work and savings incentives in Social Security, which is difficult. But right now, it's based on basically your highest 35 years of earnings. So we sort of changed it to give them sort of like the PPI, looking at every year, so that every year of work benefits count. Because right now, if you start getting into your late 50s, early 60s, the return on your payroll taxes can be negative for some people. So we would change that to make sure there's some incentive to keep working and contributing to the system.
All right. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, our plan was pretty simple. I mean, we did make some modest, but I think meaningful benefit enhancements to the survivor benefits, the minimum benefit. But mostly, the major component is just that we eliminated the cap on the Social Security wage tax, which I think goes up to, so that would only affect people earning over $133,000 or so. And that prolongs the life of Social Security solvency for, until something like 2074.
We did not remove the cap, which I know it's kind of a staple of a lot of budget plans is remove the cap. I did not. I just raised the payroll tax for Social Security 1 percentage point. The reason is because I think the first problem is you remove the cap. If you now include state, FICA, and federal, you're up to now about a 65% marginal rate at the top, and you haven't addressed Medicare yet. And you haven't really done much else yet. And if you believe Medicare is the bigger problem, it's really dangerous to use up most of your tax hikes on the rich just for Social Security. Additionally, my plan, the MI plan, was more interested in paring back benefits for upper income retirees rather than raising the taxes paid by the upper income into the program, because I think there's more generational equity there. I would rather cut spending on the rich at the top, take away Medicare subsidies for the rich, take away generate Social Security benefits for the rich, rather than jack up their taxes during their working life, which has all sorts of economic impacts, and also, like I said, takes away a lot of your upper income tax hikes before you even got into the Medicare program, which is so much bigger.
I mean, AI took a similar approach because we did move to a flat benefit structure, which would be a benefit increase for people with the lowest lifetime earnings, but would be a benefit cut for people with the highest lifetime earnings. And we avoided the need to increase payroll taxes.
We're almost out of time, but let me ask one more question to all of you. Now that you've had a chance to read and see each other's plans, are there any things that you wish you had put in your own plans that you've seen other people propose?
Do you want to just go down?
Sure, we can all answer that.
I can answer. So I like in the PPI plan for Social Security, there's a caregiver credit, right? So it gives credit for Social Security benefits for people who have taken time out of the workforce. So anyways, I think that's a really meaningful thing. And I think also the PPI and EPI plans also did a lot of good things to address recession, thinking about future recessions and how we're going to use fiscal policy in a counter-cyclical way. And so anyway, I appreciated those aspects of their plans.
So I already mentioned some things like with the flattened benefit in AEI. On CAP's plan, I think we went through a long process developing our health plan. Originally, we started with something that looked a lot more like Medicare Extra. I think there's a lot to like there. For EPI, I admire the fact that all these candidates talk about single-payer healthcare. They actually found a way to do the revenues for it. As I said, BPC's plan, I'm a big fan of the Social Security reform overall. I admired Brian's decision to try to be politically realistic and delay reforms till when it was politically possible to show that we could still get something done. I see I'm taking up a lot of other people's time.
But you're being bipartisan. That's what we're aiming for. So thank you. But go ahead, Alan.
Well, so I mean, a number of the plans I think had immigration components to them, and I think we at AI would believe there's definitely room to make improvements there, to increase the immigration of high-skilled people, and to make other changes, make the immigration system more efficient. We just left that out. We decided that was really just outside the scope of what we were going to do in this particular project. We increased the gasoline tax in our plan to provide adequate funding for transportation, but I know at least one of the plans switched to a vehicle miles tax. Again, something we kind of viewed as outside the scope of what we were prepared to do under this particular plan, but I think that actually makes a lot of sense.
I think in this, so two things sort of stuck out to me. One is, and again, Brian now we're sort of on the idea he's okay with the carbon tax. This wasn't part of the plan. I would like to have a longer discussion about the carbon tax. Now it seems like all of us here agree that that's where we're going. Because again, the cost of something does not always equal the price. And the price you pay for gasoline does not equal the cost to society. So we need to talk about what we do with the revenues, because that's very important for discussion of what we do with the carbon tax, what level to set at. So I would love to see more of a discussion. Now that I know we're all on board, that would have been great. Some proposals talk about paid family leave. That's something that's getting a lot of attention, whether that's good, bad, how do you fund it? The three plans, I think, had a paid family leave proposal. BPC is trying to work on something to see if we can fit something in. That's another area that I think is something where we have some common ground we should discuss further.
I should have started my proposals in 2021 instead of 2023. I could have gotten my debt number down. I'm very self-conscious. Additionally, I probably could have put in the carbon tax as long as you had the low-income rebates as well, because I don't want. I really did. One of the tenets of my plan is no benefit cuts and no tax hikes for the bottom 40%. And so I could have put in carbon tax and just emphasize the rebates. And that way I wouldn't stick out as being an individual.
Sorry about that. Gordon?
So I think we've covered a lot, which is the overlap on carbon tax, and comprehensive immigration reform, and AI on health, and I admire Brian's just sort of outlook on recognizing the constraints. I would imagine we all sort of confronted maybe some difficult decisions in this episode that for those of us who've done this several times over, it's gotten harder. And this time around, I was making decisions I otherwise would not have.
Interesting point.
I think all of the plans recognize that.
So Sarthi, anything left over that you would have incorporated?
Well, sure. First, I wanted to just thank Josh Bivens and Hunter Blair from EPI, who did all the work on the EPI plan. And second, I think there are two areas where I was really pleased to see all the bipartisan support, and the carbon tax, as you said, Jason, and the repeal of the step-up basis. So that it's nice to see that there are some ways in which we're moving in the same direction, recognizing that there are key things that can be done and should be done with the tax code that will lead us to both a more efficient and a more fair outcome. So I'm looking forward to reading more details from all the plans. I haven't had time to fully absorb them, but I think there's a lot there to enjoy.
Okay. I had an important note before you end this, because something that was brought up. One of the things we all challenged with is we're now 4 or 5 years beyond the last challenge we did. Our choice architecture set has decreased. It's narrowed. We are losing options. We are having to make choices now we wouldn't have made 4 years ago. We wait 2 more years, we wait 4 more years, that choice set narrows. We're trying to protect various people from current benefit cuts. At some point, we will not be able to do that. So the key is we really need to act now. We keep delaying and delaying. We really need to do this now.
Thank you for echoing the Peterson mantra. Yes, act now, don't postpone. So we're not done. So at this point, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to break up into what we call a plan fair. So each participant is going to be at a table. This is the opportunity for you all to talk to them individually for about half an hour or so. The idea is for you to sort of gather some thoughts about how you think about these ideas, and then we'll have a few minutes at the end for you to give feedback to us, either about the plans or the way the Solutions Initiative was structured. So we'll stop with that. Please join me in thanking our panel for participating. And yep, let's have some discussions.